Hi, everyone. My name is Bash Hallow. I work with Animal Medical of New City. I'm here today to talk about an op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times on September 3rd. It was written by cognitive scientist Alexandra Horowitz, who studies dogs. And in the op-ed piece, she is asking whether or not we're trying to spay and neuter our way out of responsible pet ownership. She makes some interesting points. She says that in the past, we've spayed and neutered our pets to try to reduce the spay population, to try to decrease the risks of some disease, and to try to change the behavior in pets. She argues that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that none of this works, that we actually may be increasing the amount of disease in dogs and cats when we spay them, that spaying and neutering does not change the behavior of some dogs or cats, and that the reason that she says that if there's any decrease at all in the number of pets that are being euthanized or ending up in shelters, she argues that it's because we don't let them run free as much as we used to, or that we microchip them, and that allows us to, for pet owners and pets, to be reunited. So great, interesting idea. Are we as a society trying to spay and neuter ourselves out of responsible pet ownership? So I brought Dr. Howard Gittelman, who is the medical director and owner of Animal Medical of New City, and he's going to talk about this with us today. So Dr. Gittelman, out of the gate, I would ask you, what do you think about the piece? Do you agree with the points that Ms. Horowitz is making, that we should step up to the plate as a society and become more responsible pet owners instead of leaning on spay and neutering to make a lot of the problems of pet ownership go away?
Gosh, a lot of what she said really resonated with me. I don't think this is new information for us in the profession, but we've been battling, shaking up the paradigms that we've been sort of weaned off of since we came out of veterinary school, in my case, 35 years ago. Change happens slowly, though, and I think we have to keep an open mind and listen to these disruptors, so to speak, to really formulate our own opinion. I think we're in the age right now where we're really very much keyed into the idea of evidence-based medicine. Much of what she says, I believe, is accurate in many respects, but I think, we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we need to start looking at these things from an evidence-based perspective, start collecting data, much like many of them.
Oh, yeah. That dog needs to be neutered, huh?
Much like, many of these initiatives start out, like the Golden Retriever longevity studies, are looking at what are the risk factors for dogs and really looking in a retrospective way. But you really have to be careful interpreting the data, because these are epidemiologic studies that look at risk factors, not causality. So that doesn't necessarily mean that because we see an increase in the risk of certain conditions and shortened in their lifespan, that they're necessarily causative. But I think it does raise really important issues that, our reproductive organs are more than just reproductive organs, they're endocrine organs, and I think they serve important functions. And we live in a society where everyone wants a quick fix. That's why, veterinary behaviorists have probably the highest recidivism rate in all the different parts of our profession, the specialties, because people want simple solutions. I think it is sad that a lot of our pets end up in shelters because they have problems that are insurmountable that people can't work through. But I think in our practice, we do speak to this to all of our new pet owners. But I'll tell you, it's difficult getting every veterinarian on the same page about this because, we're taught to basically be scientists. We're taught in a very didactic way that we need evidence. And much of what we have today regarding the evidence of preventative diseases such as breast cancer is old data. And if that study that was done, I agree. That study was done 25 years ago, it would never be able to pass the rigors and standards that were required to publish today.
So I have to break away here, though. As my experience working as a vet tech in veterinary medicine, I do think, if you had a male cat that's not neutered, I would say it's next to sometimes impossible to live with that cat once it's sexually mature. And I would say the same is true for a female cat that's not been spayed. Once she reaches sexual maturity and she comes into her heat cycles, I would say it's very difficult to live with that cat. I mean, that might be, I don't know. Am I selfish because I don't want to live with a cat that's spraying in my home, or a cat that, is coming into heat every, I don't know how many weeks and seems to be kind of going crazy because she can't get bred?
Bash, that's an excellent question. There are many feline behaviorists and proponents of feline healthcare that believe many of the medical problems we have in cats today are because we forced them to live within the confines of our household. They don't get the social stimulation, the exercise, the intellectual stimulation of preying, which is what most cats do. Much of the urinary tract diseases we see are believed to be due to boredom and stress of boredom in the household. So I agree, it's very difficult to live with a cat that's not neutered. But when you neuter that cat, you decrease their prey drive. In very simple terms, they become basically couch potatoes. They get overweight. They don't have any stimulation. They're prone to a bunch of different medical problems. And we've converted this pet into now a house pet. So I guess the bigger question resonates back to her original point in her article is, are pets there to serve our pleasure? Or do we have to find some way of coexisting with them in their own space so we can share that rather than control it? And I don't have the answer, but I think it raises very important ethical questions.
Fine, but I mean, if I come to Animal Medical of New City with a new cat, I mean, are we going to talk about? Are we going to talk esoterically about spaying or neutering my pet, or are you going to give me like? I mean, aren't you going to advise me? I think that for your sanity and for the well-being of you two living together, you should spay or neuter this cat.
All right. If you are a cat owner, we will have a conversation about what it means to be a responsible pet owner and having a household cat. First question, is your cat going to go outdoors? And we'll discuss what are the risks and benefits of being an indoor versus an outdoor cat. What are the benefits of spaying and neutering versus the disadvantages? So we'll have an honest conversation about that. But I would never have a cat in my household that's not neutered, male at least, because they're hard to live with. The odor is really overwhelming. And they do definitely spray more in the house. There's no question about that. The other medical conditions that we see in unspayed and neutered pets are real, and the risk factors are greater for them. But there's a trade-off in all of this. So why would I want to neuter my male dog? Well, they will lift their leg more in the house. There's no question about it. So that's kind of annoying. They do hump more, which, as she referred to in the article, is just something we have to accept as being a natural function. Male dogs that are not neutered tend to stray more. They wander more. They get out of the house. They chase after females that are in heat miles away. They get hit by a car. They eat garbage. They're just bad boys, and that's what boys are. And yes, you can train that by being a responsible pet owner, but it's harder to manage. The same reason why, a lot of horse farms don't keep stallions, because they're harder to manage. So I think there's definite medical advantages in each, with each breed, and particularly with the size of the dog and the sex, present different problems. Male dogs, they do get testicular cancer when they get older. You can prevent that. They do get hernias that are related to being intact, and prostatic problems. But guess what? When you neuter a male dog, the risk, not cause, but risk for prostate cancer goes up. So it's not a blanket thing that we cure all of the reproductive problems by neutering them. We just get rid of some, make the risk less for others, and increase the risk for others later. I think that the consensus pretty much in the current state of where we're at, veterinarians are taking, the profession at least is taking a softer stance and saying, if you're going to spay neuter, we recommend waiting to 18 to 24 months in a large breed dog.
So that's a great jumping off point for those two studies that she cites. She cites both out of the University of California, Davis. She talks about the study that was done with large breed dogs that had increased risk of joint disease if they were neutered too early. And I think that there was another one that I actually hadn't read about, which was that there was an increase of risk of cancers in large breed dogs that had been neutered in general, or was that too early? I don't know the details of that study.
I think Again, it's an epidemiologic study, and we have to really drill down at the data. But certain breeds had higher risk for certain cancers, not all the same. So I think it was, for Bernese Mountain Dogs, for instance, they may have been more prone to getting hemangiosarcomas, but only in the male, not in the female. And the Rottweilers, we know that they have a shorter lifespan, and the average number of years where they retain their ovaries for was 5 years before they had beneficial effect of living an average of 8 years versus 13 years. Well, that's notable. And I think we should look at that data and start saying, instead of, just having confirmation bias and choosing not to agree with it, we should look at it and investigate that, design studies that are intended to look at that. I think that's important.
So, in your practice, have you changed the age at which you recommend dogs or cats are spayed and neutered?
Generally speaking, with large breed dogs, we have pushed it out to 18 to 24 months. And the reason being is that we are concerned about orthopedic problems. If we neuter a pet early in life, it tends to delay the closure of the growth plates. They get taller and bigger, and their conformation changes. That predisposes them to orthopedic issues. The other concern, of course, is that when you spay and neuter them, they get overweight, and that may be why we're seeing the orthopedic problems in a greater frequency. So if we keep our pets intact and we allow them to get overweight, well, that doesn't really solve anything. But it is easier to control their metabolic rate and the amount of food they consume and maintain a healthy weight when they have their normal complement of hormones.
So she also talks about alternatives to spaying and neutering, like chemical sterilization, like vasectomies for male dogs, or like having female dogs' tubes tied.
So if you decide you want to keep their ovaries, and in fact, in some countries in Japan, they're doing what we would call the opposite spay. They take the uterus out and leave the ovaries in. There, the dog will still come into heat, but obviously can't get pregnant because it doesn't have, the full reproductive tract. You can ligate tubal ligations very simply, laparoscopically. We already spay them that way. So that's not a complicated thing to do. But it does still not eliminate double negative, I'm sorry, but they're still at higher risk for developing uterine infections that can be life-threatening later on in life. But again, we need to look at the risk factors. What is the risk for a pet developing a pyometra later in life, which is that uterine infection we're talking about, much like appendicitis in a person, but it happens in the uterus, versus them having a shorter lifespan because they've been deprived of their endocrine functionality. I question too is the amount of hormonal excess we see in older dogs, much the way we see it in ferrets, by the way. They develop Cushing's disease at a very early age because the adrenal gland takes over that function of producing those hormones when we remove it. And are we seeing such a high rate or incidence of that because most of our pets are spayed and neutered, and now do we start seeing this rampant upregulation by the adrenal glands to compensate for that? That's a question. I don't have an answer for it, but it seems like the most common endocrinopathies we see in dogs are low thyroid levels and excess cortisol levels that are endogenous. I think somebody should really consider looking at that because we know in ferrets that's certainly the case, and they're spayed incredibly early in life.
Great. So if I'm a pet owner, let's say of a pure breed, because I feel like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like owners of pure breed dogs maybe are more inclined to want to leave that female or that male intact, whether it's a cat or a dog. So if I have a pure breed dog and I have a lot of questions about spaying and neutering, I'm assuming I can come to Animal Medical. You're going to talk to me about the specific pros, the pros and cons as it pertains specifically to me, my home, my family, my pet. Is that correct?
That's correct. And hopefully when you get a pet, if it's not already spayed and neutered, we encourage you to visit with us so we can have that conversation. And they're really, with the small breed dogs, we tend to spay them earlier because a lot of those conditions you spoke of, that is the orthopedic problems, obesity, tend to be bigger problems with large breed dogs.
Well, excuse me, but is that only because those are only because the studies were done on large breed dogs and that's all the information we have, or has that actually been shown?
Yeah. No, it's very possible, but I do think that I think some studies have been done across different breeds, but I honestly can say I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
It is worthwhile exploring. Um, you know, when we talk about cats, for instance, I think that they don't have the size, a breadth of, you know, a size that we have to be concerned with dogs. So that tends to be a much easier conversation. You know, we spay them earlier because honestly, yes, there's an inconvenience and there is a cat problem, overpopulation, and cats do get out and they get bred. I would, by the way, not completely discount the successes that have been made in the shelter environment by early spay neuter. But I think that, you know, the thing we're missing in that is their agenda is very clear. Overpopulation, they're passionate about it and they believe in it.
Wait, when you say their agenda, you mean the rescue organizations?
Yeah, you know, shelter medicine is very much geared towards, you know, controlling infectious diseases that are spread in close confines and stopping overpopulation. And I think they've been successful, at least from the outset, looking at the data that we've seen, the number of pets that are euthanized. But the bigger issue is that these pets now end up in somebody's home. And now the responsibility becomes the pet owner's responsibility. And now we're supposed to counsel owners on what that means. And reproductive health is part of that. So they've kind of, you know, taken over that portion of the conversation. And in many cases, we don't even get to see those pets until now they're older and they have problems. So I do feel that the shelter medicine's agenda is, although we all want animal welfare in the end, I think their agenda still somewhat bypasses what the profession's purpose is in counseling clients about the pet's health through the rest of their life. It's not just about, you know, preventing overpopulation and we're done.
Thank you. So, and then I'm sure people are going to have questions about this. If I do want my dog to have a vasectomy, or if I do want to have my female dog's tubes tied, or I mean, actually, I don't even know what drugs you would use for chemical sterilization. Can you talk? Is that a service that I could get at Animal Medical, or any of those services available at Animal Medical? And can you talk a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about chemical sterilization?
Well, chemical sterilization for male dogs has come you know, into the forefront repeatedly over the last several years. You know, it really has to do with how much we can get the profession to adopt a change in perspective. But the original study that was done was done with too high of a dose of the major zinc compound, and they've modified it since. So now the dose is supposed to be a little bit, but will not completely eliminate testosterone levels, but enough to sterilize them through causing an inflammatory reaction in the testicle. Well, and I think the reason we don't feel comfortable adopting
that sounds horrible.
It sounds painful. So I didn't want to do that. I felt like, well, you know, if I'm going to give them, it's going to be a painful process. Let's make it quick and, you know, one and done. So I think that if we're concerned about preventing pets from reproducing, then I think, you know, vasectomy makes total sense. You know, and in the case of female, tubal ligation, but then you have to deal with the fact the hormones are intact. I don't like the idea of chemical sterilization. I think that intrinsically it seems like a bad idea, although it does work. And in some areas, you know, impoverished areas where people don't have access to veterinary care, I think it makes sense because you can control overpopulation, the stray population, where it's a real issue, like in some of the third world countries. But I think in our country, to do that as a first line, I didn't really see how that was better than what we're already doing.
And you would offer a pet owner a vasectomy or a tubal ligation? I mean, you have you know, as you pointed out earlier, you're already doing minimally invasive spays and neuters at your practice. Is this something a service that you can offer clients, or no?
Yeah, I would have no problems having that conversation and talking about the pros and cons. I just think that usually the sticking point with most people is they don't want the menses every 6 months and the mess in an 80-pound dog. Because it's
been a female dog you're talking about.
Yeah, female dog. And the male dog, I think that most people who choose not to neuter their pets really are not concerned about whether they're going to get another dog pregnant, because they have the male, they don't have the female. They had a female in the house, then it may be an issue.
Okay, great.
So, you know, I think at the end of the day, I think it's important to be transparent about what we don't know. It is interesting to see the dichotomy between different countries and how she claims that many European countries don't have these I haven't fact checked that, to be very honest, but it's clear that in different cultures, spaying and neutering is not as commonplace as it is here as an automatic process.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I don't know, I mean, I think that you said at the opening of this that you thought it was great to have Ms. Horowitz be this disruptor to something that we've, as a society and maybe as a profession, we've been on autopilot for a while. It's
Absolutely.
great to have this kind of thought injected and this kind of dialogue happening. And, you know, I feel that for myself, I mean, certainly with behavior, I wish that more pet owners took pet behavior more seriously. I think that we tolerate bad behavior in dogs, especially large dogs, well, when they're puppies. But then when they're 80 pounds, that bad behavior can be intolerable, if not dangerous. And I wish that more people took animal behavior, cat and dog behavior seriously, because I think it would prevent a lot of dogs ending up in shelters or a lot of unhappy pet and pet parent relationships.
I think that one of her, and I agree completely, and one of her her important take-home points, which I think may have gotten brushed over, was that pet ownership is not a plug-and-play situation, and there's a huge amount of responsibility and cost that goes along with that. And yes, financial, but emotional cost. And it's very frustrating for behavioral problems and people to deal with them, feeling that they're just not getting headway because they haven't really figured out how to solve this. And animal behavior is such a complex, situation that so many people have a different opinion about how to manage. There's never, one way to treat or manage behavioral problems, but I think it's a general consensus that, a positive reinforcement type of training experience is the one that's going to be most successful. And pet owners have to, kind of wrap their head around that punishment seems to be the natural approach to managing pet problems, behavioral problems. And those problems are the most common reason why pets get displaced into shelters. So they really need to have a strong basis for what, is ethical and appropriate behavioral intervention with pets that's preventative, and not, treat in many cases, their dog as they would treat their children, expecting punishment to be successful. It just is not as effective. And I think people have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. It takes a lot of, incentive on their own and steadfastness to say, okay, we're going to approach this, from a perspective that is, it's safer for the pet, it's morally just, and it's more effective, but that's harder. So when we talk about the responsibility, that's our first responsibility, provide a safe environment for our pets where they can learn in a loving way. And I think that's the part of this whole op-ed, I think that was an undercurrent, but to me is really rose to the surface because, pets are there not at our pleasure. They're here to enhance our life, but just because we can do things, it doesn't mean we should. And we always have to ask ourselves, should we be doing these things for our pets because technology is there or because, this is what we've been doing for 30 years and we don't really question it. So.
Thank you. So as a reminder, you and the rest of your team available for questions by phone. Certainly they can come in, make an appointment for a consultation if they need it for their pet. Thanks so much for digging into this with me. I really appreciate it. It's always great.
Thank you, Bash. It's an exciting conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.